Hello. So, I guess it makes sense to start this off by examining why you should vote. Well, voting is an important part of evoking your voice in your local, state, and federal political system. There may be a lot of different personal reasons for why you would want to take part in the process, but one common reason is that the officials we elect and the measures we endorse are meant to represent our interests and act on our behalf. We do this because our time is limited, and rather than spend it worrying about things like having access to clean water, maintenance of the roads and sidewalks, and oversight of law enforcement, it's more time effective to have a small group of people who can represent our interests, whose job it is to worry about these things for us, and whose skill set allows them to do that job better than we could. It's the point of a representative democracy. It's to make it easier for the reasonable contributors to society to live their lives and do what they want, and to enjoy themselves while they do it. So, getting into a couple of the reasons why you might not want to vote. One of the big ones is politicians are just generally bad at what they do. The news is always covering some story or another about corruption or incompetence, and, well, while it is true that elected officials have been known to be very bad at their jobs, you can just search online for U.S. politician scandal, and it'll supply you with an endless stream of ammunition to feed into this argument for why voting is pointless. But there are two decent rebuttals to this line of thinking depending on your perspective. So, first of all, if you're of the opinion that my previous statement can be extrapolated to mean that most politicians are bad, simple math can easily convince you otherwise. If you Google the terms above, the search yields about 958,000 results at the time of my research in the news tab. It's no small number for sure, even though at least some of those are probably multiple articles about the same scandal. For the sake of argument, we can assume that there are 958,000 separate political scandals in this fairly comprehensive web search, because there's probably not more. So, according to U.S. Census data from 1992, there's approximately 519,000 elected officials in the United States who serve terms between 2 and 6 years, with the exception of judges, some of whom carry out crazy long terms, and lifetime in some cases. That means less than 2 officials in each of the 958,000 offices across the U.S. have been known to have scandals, and this is in the almost 2 decades since internet journalism began. While you can't discount the possibility that a person seeking office is doing so for unaltruistic purposes, it's really not fair to assume that any politician or political hopeful will be corrupt or dishonest by default. Ultimately, the only way to increase your certainty that the candidate you select will be honest and capable is to find evidence of those qualities in your candidate's personal or professional background. So, the other way of thinking is that if you believe that politicians are ineffective because the bureaucratic system around them is effective. And my best argument for you is that the only effective way to change the system without going to court is to support legislators and executives who agree with you that the system is ineffective. And the way to do that is at the polls on election day. If you believe that your candidate might not win, by supporting them at their polls, you're informing the winners that members of their constituency are in support of these ideas. And you're also informing your fellow voters that there are people around them who feel that the issues championed by your candidate deserve to be heard. This is all due to a very tricky beast known as statistics, but basically, even if your candidate doesn't win, there's still a reason to vote. There's still a reason to do that. That leads to another common argument, which is that even if you made the effort to vote for the candidate that you truly support, the numbers aren't on your side. The only way to vote effectively is to strategically vote against your own interests. So, this is a sentiment that it's hard to argue against because I've personally had it in the past, and so it's really a special interest to me in particular, the idea that strategic voting is something that you should engage in. And it's a tricky one because it's supported by statistics and scientifically minded people, some of whom I respect greatly. Strategic voting, which I define as making the conscious decision to vote against your best interests in an effort to mitigate the chances of contributing to an even worse result. While I don't refute the basis of this idea, there are some significant aspects of the topic that I think get omitted when this brand of statistical analysis takes the front seat. And that is the cynical effect that it has on the voting population, as well as the statistical analysis that doesn't get seen. By voting strategically, the first thing you do is relinquish the idea that your values and ideas will be well represented. You probably at least hope that your concerns will be addressed by the candidate you ultimately supported, but they might give precedent to other issues or platforms which you disagreed with. Remember, it's only strategic voting if you vote for a candidate that you don't want to win. That's not to say that any vote for a main party candidate is a strategic vote. It depends completely on the intention behind the action. You may also feel a small amount of guilt, even when the candidate you ultimately voted for wins, because you know that the statistical analysis will reflect this election in the next cycle when they mention or don't mention the lack of support for the candidate you most agreed with. Much of this, I believe, contributes to the lack of participation by people who are fully capable of voting but dissatisfied with the voting game. Also, as I've stated in my previous video, how to register to vote anywhere in the United States right now, the participation rate of citizens who are eligible to vote in midterm elections is near 40%. One way to view that number is cynically. Confidence in the voting system may be very low, people have trouble accessing services, and any number of bleak notions really can be cast by focusing on the 40%, but there is a different way to view that number. Saying 40% of voters voted is the same thing as saying 60% of potential voters didn't vote. Now, you may notice that 60% of votes is enough of a majority to sweep any election. If they were for a single candidate. In fact, even if two candidates split that number of votes, at least one of them would lead in a runoff election. The 40% of the voting population currently split mostly between main parties could not, statistically speaking, outvote any one main party or two or fewer third-party candidates with the support of the wider disenfranchised voting community. This, of course, would require a candidate who can both appeal to those who won't vote and provide services to those who can't vote. Services which are usually as basic as transportation, information, or help filing forms, but with those two factors, a formerly unpopular candidate could gain traction very quickly. When you support the candidate you truly agreed most with, even if that candidate loses the election this time, the support of your vote, as well as that of like-minded voters, is engraved in history, and in the next election cycle, a new wave of voters, encouraged by the knowledge that they're in good company, will expand the margins, and as it's reported, those margins will grow wider. So, another common argument is people who don't vote as a way of expressing their dissatisfaction with the voting system. People who say, I want to let the system know that it must be fixed before I invest my time engaging with it. So this is another line of thought that I've had personally. In 2012, the first year I decided to vote, I read up on all the candidates for president, and I chose the one that I agreed with the most. After that election, I discovered strategic voting and became very disillusioned with the idea of voting. I didn't want to vote for a third-party candidate because it made things worse and they wouldn't win, and I didn't want to vote for the least bad main-party candidate because it felt dishonest to myself. So because of that, in the 2016 election, I decided to withhold my vote for president. I selected my congresspeople as well as the other offices without having done any research, mostly for the show of it, and submitted my ballot with no candidate selected. I sent a message is what I thought to myself. But even if my attitude towards the system was genuine, my message was not at all clearly received, because even though a lot of people like me intended to send a vote of dissatisfaction, what we really sent was a vote of confidence. Whatever the rest of the country decides is fine. By doing this, the margins needed for victory became narrower for each abstaining voter until the winner was decided with support from a little under 26% of eligible voters. The election went off without a hitch, and there has not been a concerted legislative or executive effort to address low turnout since that point. Reform doesn't come from inaction, it only comes from elected officials who push for reform. So, final argument. I want to vote for a candidate who's going to win, or I don't want to vote for a candidate that's not going to win. Now, this is just not a smart way to vote. Elections are a platform for public discourse. They exist to allow citizens to voice their concerns and raise up the people who most represent those concerns so that they may address those concerns, as well as those realized by other elected officials in a constructive way. Because of this, it's important to vote honestly, in order to make sure that even if your sentiment isn't the majority, it is still being heard and represented accurately. The conversations around elections are very competitively phrased. They're competitions after all, but not competitions like baseball or basketball. Voters are not observers rooting for one team or another to score more points. Elections are high-stakes job interviews, several candidates vying for one very sought-after position which the voters are hiring for. Each one makes their best case for why they can serve the voters better than their competition. Candidates aren't campaigning to win something, they're campaigning to start a new job in which they will work for a short number of years before being reevaluated in the next election. So don't worry about winning for your team. Vote as a way of contributing your will to that of the greater decision-making process. That's kind of like a better way to think of it. So, double finally. And this is probably the most difficult reason to argue against, which is that you don't vote because of experiences that you've had in the past where you feel like you were let down by the system. Things like voter roll cleaning, unsavory polling station experiences, disproportionate difficulty in registering or voting. Those are all valid arguments to have, and I can't argue against you feeling like investing your time into the voting system might not be worth it. Now, while you certainly have the best reason of anyone for not voting, your voices are actually the most valuable in any election. your experiences highlight real issues that are worth paying attention to and worth correcting. So even if voting seems impossible for you, you can still have your voice heard by sending correspondence to your elected officials. As mentioned above, they work for you whether you agree with them or not, and you have the right to hold them responsible for the failures of the system. For problems with voting specifically, the most productive official to contact is your state Secretary of State, as their office is in charge of regulating polls and voter registration services within your jurisdiction. So that wraps it up. Those are a few really good reasons to vote if you don't want to. I've been Onespar Weekly, and this has been the Political Par-Tay. Part 3 will involve how to vote. See you in November.